fea la situación, ¿no? Está fea la situación, pero pues...
Cientos de empleos y esto duplicaría el número de empleos en la región. Que también esta nueva inversión se acaba
Todos tenemos que comer.
en los próximos días se anunciará que es el Pacto Industrial Puerta del Pacífico. Esto generará alrededor de $200 millones y más de 20.000 empleos terminará su operación. Y pues ya como lo mencionó nuestro gobernador, la carretera.
2 months ago, CNN released a video titled, "The Sinaloa Cartel Told Us What They Think of President Trump." In the video, we got to follow Isabel Young, the network's long-form documentary senior correspondent, as she traveled across the Mexican state of Sinaloa to document the violence and emotions that have governed the region since last September. Young talked to members of the army, victims of the violence, paramedics, and, most controversially, an alleged member of the cartel. That last one garnered a lot of negative attention, especially from right-wing media members who suggested that Western journalists shouldn't be sympathizing with designated terrorists, and adding that some of her questions were a little partisan.
I mean, according to the Trump administration, you are a terrorist. I mean, the cartels have been labeled a foreign terrorist organization. What do you make of that?
While I don't agree with the specific criticisms or underlying ideologies that frame the right-wing critique, I don't care about whether a journalist has interviewed a designated terrorist or not. I do agree with one thing, and that's that this video was terrible. To me, it feels like 10 minutes of reaction farming slop, bouncing from softball interview to softball interview, trying its best to look bold and independent while doing nothing more than simply pointing the camera at willing participants and asking them to say something that we could have predicted ourselves. While there can sometimes be a use in such journalism, as casting a wide net and giving subjects the space to speak freely can humanize them and force the viewer to rethink things, this video does none of that. Not a single part of the video forces the viewer to seriously reconsider any of their predetermined notions about the war on drugs or the people involved. What do we learn in this video? We learn that the army is omnipresent, hard at work, and probably a little corrupt. We learn that the cartel is mysterious, detached from the morality of their crimes, and focused on feeding their families. And we learn that the victims are sad and jaded. None of this is surprising, none of this is shocking, and quite frankly, none of this is worth reporting with the air of profundity that CNN was trying to create. Especially when it comes to issues like the war on drugs, what American audiences need is a chance to see through the chaos and confusion and understand what's going on in a more specific and measured way. Anything less than that equates to a glorified fictional short film. We don't need a journalist to put her boots on the ground just for us to find out that the victims are frustrated and that the cartel blames American consumers for the drug market. I could learn the same thing and more by watching Narcos Mexico or something. What American viewers do need to learn is who the victims of organized crime really are. What are the deeper material interests that perpetuate the violence, and what players are involved directly beneath the surface? These are hard questions to ask, especially in a country like Mexico, where journalists often find themselves dead for getting too close to the truth. But if CNN's crew wanted to do anything more than simply posture as bold truth tellers, then maybe they could have dug a little deeper and poked at these questions. No worries though, because in this video, I'm going to be doing just that. Focusing on Sinaloa specifically, I'll try my best to contextualize the state's historic rise in violence over the past 9 months, and then I'll try to highlight some of the more unknown players in the drug war that CNN's crew should have talked to. I can't guarantee that you'll walk away from this video with answers, but I can promise that you will more clearly see how the war on drugs might be a little more complicated than a 10-minute uncritical CNN documentary would lead you to believe. So with that being said, let's just get started.
Hoy se cumplen 9 meses de violencia en Sinaloa, producto del conflicto entre dos facciones de un grupo de delincuentes. La violencia se extendió
Released in May and recorded, to my knowledge, mostly around mid-April, CNN's video depicts a Sinaloa months into what local journalists have referred to as la violencia. Since September 2024, the state has seen a return to violence like never before, with the homicide rate reaching record monthly highs and disappearances following a similar trend. To the Mexican government and global media enterprises who do nothing more than simply read government press releases, there's no mystery about why the violence has spiked. The cartel is, apparently, in disarray.
Violence erupts almost every night here in Sinaloa, Mexico, the heartland of one of the most powerful criminal gangs in the world, the Sinaloa Cartel.
Since the arrest of El Chapo in 2017, the Sinaloa cartel has seen itself increasingly fractured. The years prior to the current violence were marked by historically violent confrontations between the cartel and government forces, ultimately leading to the arrests of several cartel members and encouraging the group to splinter even more. With the arrest of El Chapo's former business partner, El Mayo, in July 2024, the region was ripe for an all-out cartel civil war. That is the narrative that leads us to September 9th, 2024. On that day, an army convoy apparently found a group of armed civilians in a neighborhood of the state's capital, Culiacan. Violence erupted immediately, with the shootout evolving into city and statewide chaos. 9 months later, any signs of slowing down have yet to be seen. As of June 7th, 2025, Noroeste reports that there have been 1,445 intentional homicides, or about 5.3 per day, 1,540 people deprived of their liberty, or about 5.7 per day, 5,384 stolen vehicles, or about 19.8 per day, 1,094 people arrested, and 93 shot or killed by security authorities. I think it's important to scrutinize the factuality of any source, especially those coming from the government, but I don't necessarily have a problem buying into this cartel civil war story. Given the strategy of crime reduction that the Mexican authorities employ, the idea that the cartel would splinter and cause even more violence is not that crazy. What the military is engaging in by targeting the most high-profile cartel leaders is known as the kingpin strategy, which itself closely aligns with the concept of leadership decapitation, which is kind of the primary way that Western forces like to deal with quote-unquote terrorist groups. It makes sense that because of the government's militance and commitment to leadership decapitation, violence would spiral out of control. As Jenna Jordan demonstrated in her book on the subject, leadership decapitation is well understood as an ineffective means at countering terrorism. As she put it, speaking in the context of Islamist terror groups, the database created for this study indicates that, overall, decapitation is not an effective strategy. First, it does not increase a group's mortality rate and does not result in a significant decline in organizational activity. Against the most active organizations, decapitation actually results in an increase in activities. Jordan outlined the many factors that go into the success of leadership decapitation, with some of those factors including popular support, organizational structure, and group ideology. And though the Mexican drug cartels do not necessarily operate with the same ideological fervor or popular support as some Islamist groups, they are highly bureaucratic, and they don't often require a strong and centralized leadership in order to operate. This decentralized, bureaucratic structure should, under Jordan's framework, make cartels very strong against decapitation efforts. So, is the government just incompetent?
Este laboratorio ya no va a ser reubicado a otro lado. Lo que hay aquí se va a destruir ahora mismo.
Surely not. I mean, let's not forget that besides the fact that the Mexican military is highly sophisticated in its own right, this is not just Mexico fighting the cartels. For nearly 20 years now, the American government has been directly training and supporting Mexico's war on drugs, and the State Department is arguably the architect of the current model for cartel suppression. Ignoring the deep history of American involvement in Mexico last century, we can pinpoint the start of this relationship to 2007, when the American and Mexican governments agreed to the Mérida Initiative, a plan to hyper-militarize the war on drugs. Mexican armies received American training, American weapons, and American intelligence for over a decade thanks to the Mérida Initiative. The result, contrary to the stated goals, was a mind-numbing 100% rise in crime and absolute social devastation for millions within the country. There's a lot I can get into about the way that militarization often preceded and helped to facilitate explosions in crime, but my goal for this video is to focus on Sinaloa and its more recent past, so I'll save that discussion for another day. Regardless, after a decade of chaos and crime at the hands of the Mérida Initiative, the agreement eventually died. With the rise of Mexico's left-leaning Morena party and their new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the stated plan for crime reduction was rerouted from militants to social reform, and AMLO's catchphrase of "hugs, not bullets" was born. AMLO's nationalist, anti-imperialist, and anti-corporate rise gave way to the bicentennial framework for security, public health, and safe communities, a reworking of the initial Mérida Initiative to focus on the aforementioned social reform in lieu of militants. Unfortunately, AMLO's words proved to be empty across his tenure. The systematic militance of the Mexican government not only continued, but grew under AMLO's government as army spending increased and the amount of soldiers deployed for the sake of law enforcement remained sky high. Let's not forget as well that nearly all of the important arrests and conflicts, such as the arrest of El Mayo or the two bloody battles of Culiacán, occurred under AMLO's watch, and it was these events that led directly to Sinaloa's current conditions. By the end of AMLO's term, the country saw a growth in military spending and no reduction in crime. And if you had any doubts about whether or not the American government continued to involve itself in the war on drugs after AMLO took power, I'll let Ken Salazar, America's ambassador to Mexico under Biden, speak for himself. As he put it, "We've received questions about a supposed request from the Mexican government to limit or suspend certain law enforcement activities between the United States and Mexican governments. This is false." Mind you, this was a statement he made last August after the arrest of El Mayo, which, might I remind you, was the arrest that led directly to the violence that the state is currently seeing. So once again I ask, are the Mexican and American governments just incompetent? Should someone tell them that their strategies suck? Are they just terrible at achieving their goals? The answer remains a firm no. Let me remind you, in case you didn't know or in case you forgot, that the State Department specializes in perpetual wars. See Afghanistan, see Iraq, see Syria, or literally any other country that America has intervened in. If you've ever engaged with media that is critical of American foreign policy,
we should have never been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East. They lied. They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none, and they knew there were none. There were no weapons of mass destruction.
All right. Governor,
you might remember that these wars were perpetual by design. American arms manufacturers and transnational corporations profit immensely off of these endless wars, and the violence spurred by the objectively ineffective military strategy only gives the government more reason to exert its influence and control over the region. Modern American warfare is an endless cycle, and it is unbelievably profitable for both the American government and the companies that the government contracts. I hate to break it, but the situation in Mexico and Sinaloa are no different. The war on drugs, much like the war on terror, is a conflict largely perpetuated and encouraged by the state. With the stated goal of crime reduction and cartel dismantling, the American and Mexican governments have allowed themselves to fight endlessly against a cartel boogeyman that they encouraged to spiral out of control. With chaos and violence destroying communities, transnational corporations have been able to swoop in and profit immensely. An assertion like this might be understandably difficult to digest, and in this video, I won't be offering the deep historical and political analysis needed to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. What I will do today, though, is use modern Sinaloa as a case study, illustrating how this process is unfolding in a specific region and pointing to the players that CNN's crew should have talked to if they wanted to treat this issue with the care and critical thought that it deserves. This video is not meant to be the end-all be-all to drug war analysis. Think of it more as a starting point, picking up where CNN's documentary crew so lamentfully left off. So with that context dump out of the way, let's look at the side of Sinaloa that CNN's documentary crew forgot to mention.
At Santo Tomas, initially with a 3D-induced polarization program will be comprised of 10 to 12 holes aimed at confirming and potentially expanding the historical Northstone deposit, within which is a coherent hierarchy.
If you look up Sinaloa news on Google, you will only see crime. That's because crime gets people's attention, and the profit motive behind every corporate journalism firm, such as CNN, encourages writers to defile, disrespect, and commodify the victims of crime, all for the sake of making more money and pushing certain, often reactionary, agendas. This strategy is called "if it bleeds, it leads," and it is well understood by media scholars and journalists alike. If you scroll past the wall of violence-obsessed content and into the business section of Sinaloa news, though, you might see something that you didn't know about the state. Since Sinaloa's governor, Ruben Rocha Moya, took charge in 2021, the state has seen $1.6 billion worth of capital flood in via foreign direct investments. That's over 80% of the governor's original $2 billion goal for his entire 6-year term. Rocha Moya is not quiet about the financial success his state has seen either. In press conference after press conference, Rocha Moya lauds the foreign companies that have set up shop in his state since the turn of the decade. For him, FDI signaled jobs, development, and progress. In his own words, quote, "Sinaloa is a land that attracts investment and represents a region of great opportunities." Of particular note in Sinaloa is the city of Topolobampo. In May, only a few weeks after the CNN video dropped, Rocha Moya declared the integration of the city into President Claudia Sheinbaum's larger Plan Mexico development plan. Topolobampo, now known as one of the country's 14 welfare poles, is set to receive over $13 billion worth of investments over the course of all its development projects. There are a lot of foreign companies involved with Rocha Moya's announcement, and I could spend a lot of time honing in on any one of them and examining the way they've navigated Sinaloa's chaotic environment. But for this video, I'll just focus on one. Let's examine Oroco Resource Corp.
Oroco, que ya lo mencionó también el gobernador, precisamente estuvimos la semana pasada en el municipio de Choix, que trae...
Oroco is a Canadian mining company, and though their highly celebrated project, the Santo Tomas mining project, is technically underway in the bordering municipality of Choix, the company's work is still included in the special Topolobampo Plan Mexico designation. Choix has seen a very tumultuous 2025, but you wouldn't know that if you just read the reports on Oroco's website. According to them, things are going stellar, not only for the company, but for the region as a whole. Across their spam of press releases and project updates, good news is the only thing to be seen. In scrolling the company's website, I got to learn about all the major investments and initiatives and great things coming the company's way, but I saw virtually nothing on violence. In fact, the only place where I could find any use of the word violence by Oroco was after a site-wide search, where the term appeared in a copied and pasted risk acknowledgement tucked away in an annual project assessment written by management. By and large, the view from above seems to indicate that all is well in Choix.
There are 5 hotels in the area. One of them is brand new. A local businessman has built a sports complex featuring a basketball court and baseball and soccer fields.
The reports on the ground, though, tell a much different story. You won't be able to learn much about Choix by reading American media. The municipality is too small, too rural, and too unknown for English audiences. In papers that dedicate themselves to the region, though, the turbulence in the area is no secret. In the past few months, Choix has seen a wave of violence that has resulted in mass displacement and communal upheaval. The communities affected are often so small and so rural that they aren't even marked on Google Maps. The effects of the violence have been unmistakable, though. In a statement by Rocha Moya back in April, he acknowledged that 26 people had been displaced due to preventive reasons. That same day, though, the municipal president of Choix declared that 33 people were seeking refuge in the municipal capital after violence had ran them out of their small towns. In light of the various reports on displacement, Rocha Moya declared that he had sent out 2,500 aid packages, and in the coming months, he planned to send 2,500 more. Elsewhere in the news, though, the tolls of violence started to add up a lot quicker. Also in the month of April, Los Noticieristas reported that armed individuals were reportedly throwing bombs at the homes of locals in a few small mountainous towns in the area. While some stayed where they were, many more tried to leave in order to stay safe. The amount of people displaced or killed is exceedingly unclear, with the author only writing that, quote, some managed to escape, but others didn't receive the same luck and remained stuck in their homes. What is just as unclear is whether or not authorities did anything to help. Most sources indicated to the author that authorities apparently could not reach the area because conditions did not allow it. The names of the towns mentioned in this story are notably distinct from the towns mentioned by the municipal head in her announcement about taking in 33 people. By the time May rolled around, the official toll of people displaced rose even further, as the municipal president reported that 130 people were receiving government support for being displaced. This seems to be the most recent count we have on the displaced of Choix, but with the number constantly fluctuating across reports and the lists of towns affected rarely lining up across sources, it is nearly impossible to know how many have actually been affected thus far. And all of that is only pertinent to the displaced, as the murder or death rate for any of these small places is even harder to pinpoint as of now. Across the entire state, Noroeste reports that 1,164 families have been displaced since April. Regardless, what is perhaps more troubling than the displacement is the lack of wider support that the victims are receiving. Yes, Rocha Moya did announce his plan to send more aid packages to the affected, but the well-funded army, who, mind you, are deployed across the entire country with the stated goal of law enforcement, have apparently offered close to no support or protection for these local communities. Looking beyond the story I mentioned earlier about how conditions apparently made it difficult for authorities to access these areas, there are also indications that the army is not getting directions to engage or support these tiny towns. In a video that made the rounds back in May, a woman confronted a couple of National Guard soldiers about their lack of support for these local communities, and one of the soldiers responded by lamenting that it was not up to him where he could go. It was the discretion of the higher-ups. This video understandably frustrated many, including the woman he was talking to then. But I think it's important to stress that this is no smoking gun in regards to widespread military corruption or something like that. I almost considered leaving this video out because asserting that the military is complicit based on evidence like this is cheap and easy. And it is exactly what CNN did during the 1-minute stretch of their video where they showed some of the army guys trying to block the camera and change the subject away from disappearances.
Saying, right?
Sí, pero, o sea, esto es una copia. It's a copy. Who put this? We don't know.
I do think that videos like this are important though, as they demonstrate the frustration that locals have with what they feel is an inadequate military response. For all the billions of dollars that the Mexican government spends on militarization, and for all the extra money that the American government sends in support of that project, you'd think that the army would have the facilities necessary to venture into the mountains and do something to protect these distressed local communities. The dissonance between the financial strength of the military and the actual help they provide on the ground would understandably make locals feel as if these guys are being incompetent or useless by design. And based on our prior discussion of the tactics used by the military, I do think that the locals are onto something. But I digress. In the middle of what I'd consider a humanitarian crisis in Choix, Orozco's Santo Tomas mining project is well underway. It's important to note that though Orozco's mining project and the wave of mass displacement are happening in the same municipality, they are not happening on top of each other, and I'm certainly not alleging that they are happening because of each other. The question to ask as a reporter is simply, how can a resource extraction company feel so safe to operate in a region like this? The months of April and May, the same months during which CNN recorded and released their video, were the months in which violence in Choix spiked dramatically. It was also during those months that the good news about Orozco Resource Corp and all the other development projects flooded the business columns and government press conferences alike. It's as if Sinaloa exists as two completely separate worlds, one of violence, chaos, destruction, and displacement, and one of immense profits and development prospects. A good journalist, a diligent and watchful journalist, should be capable of seeing this disparity and questioning it. Asking questions like, how could these two worlds possibly coexist, is much more interesting and likely to yield many more insights than whatever questions led the CNN crew to produce the video that they made. In my opinion, CNN's crew had an obligation to ask these questions. The notion that we can divorce the violence in Sinaloa from the immense flood of investments is preposterous, and to play into that dichotomy without ever questioning it is to capitulate to a narrative that is entirely manufactured and designed to protect these transnational corporations from scrutiny. And let's make it clear that there is a lot of history that ties these two worlds together. And exploring these leads, even if they showed no relation, would demonstrate a more thorough and thoughtful application of journalistic principles. I'd like to take the last section of this video to simply point to some past instances of capture between the Sinaloan government, transnational corporations, and organized crime. In doing so, I'd like to establish grounds that such questions are worth pursuing, and that CNN's failure to do so is an abject failure in practicing good journalism. In 2015, shockwaves were sent across the Mexican business world when 900 kilograms of gold-bearing concentrate were stolen from McEwen Mining's El Gallo facility in Sinaloa. It was a shocking $8 million worth of product that was stolen, but more shocking than the heist were the comments that McEwen CEO Rob McEwen made in the aftermath. As he put it, quote, "Generally, we have a good relationship with them. If we want to go explore somewhere, you ask them, and they tell you no, but then they'll say, come back in a couple weeks when we've finished with what we are doing." The them he was referring to in this quote was not the government or locals, but the cartel, and his comments were taken as an explicit recognition of the fact that mining and extraction companies must broker relationships with organized crime groups in order to operate in certain regions. McEwen eventually walked back his statement, obviously, claiming that his words were not a concession of collaboration, but a mere acknowledgement of the fact that the properties in this region are sometimes controlled by criminals. His deeper sentiment, though, was later affirmed by the president of the Mexican Association for Mining, Metallurgical, and Geological Engineers. In his own words, quote, "We asked the mafia for permission, the organized crime groups, and we are able to operate. Things get resolved because there are negotiations by the companies." It's kind of stunning to hear something like this admitted so openly, especially because the connection between cartels and transnational corporations is drawn so infrequently by the mainstream media. Lesser known and less well-paid journalists have been drawing the connection between capitalism and crime in Mexico for decades, but it is only on rare occasions like this that the concept trickles into the mainstream. Reporters and academics such as Luis Astorga, Julian Cardona, Don Paley, and more recently, Oswaldo Zavala have been chipping away at this depoliticized, uncritical mainstream narrative forever, and the stories they've uncovered have illustrated the inseparable relationship between organized crime and transnational companies. An investigative article by Noroeste might be most relevant for the purposes of this video. Across more than 6,000 words, the article, published in 2020, carefully details the connections between organized crime, large corporations, and displacement in Sinaloa, using statistics, case studies, and on-the-ground interviews to drive home its assertion. Within the article, we find the story of San Jose de Gracia, a small town in Sinaloa that has been a hub for mining for over a century. At the turn of this century, a company by the name of Dyna Resources made strides to set up shop in the city, obtaining a couple dozen concessions to explore and excavate the area during the 2000s. By 2010, the mine was officially opened and money started pouring in. What came as a consequence of the mine for the regular citizens of the town was the opposite of prosperity, though. As the article illustrates, in the years after Dyna Resources came to town, the city began to empty as a wave in violence forced families to evacuate. Armed men took over the city, with locals alleging that the men worked for the Sinaloa cartel, but simultaneously acknowledging that their gear was often stamped with the letters DR, reminiscent of the initials of Dyna Resources. Eventually, the city reached a point of total lockdown, with nobody allowed to enter without the express permission of the armed group. The high crime rate and remote location combined to make it nearly impossible for inspectors to reach the town and make sure that Dyna Resources was complying with environmental and safety regulations. For a brief moment in 2016, the mine was successfully shut down by the Sinaloan government for its abusive working conditions. But Dyna managed to overturn the decision by arguing that the state government had no jurisdiction over federal mining contracts. Today, Dyna Resources continues to operate out of San Jose de Gracia, and the status of crime and worker safety in the city remains up in the air. Of course, mining companies will absolutely deny any allegations of malpractice or engaging in criminal activity, and Dyna Resources was no different. Whenever any of these companies faces any scrutiny, they always turn to the same talking points, talking about how their operations are bringing jobs to the community, and how the companies spend a lot of money to build good relationships with the locals and their land. But it's difficult to reconcile these claims with the mountain of testimonies against these extraction companies, and the deaths of certain more vocal locals raises even more questions. Take Ramon Corrales Vega, a vocal activist from Choix who took up the fight against Paradox Global Resources when the company came to the region to set up an iron mine. Corrales Vega was murdered in 2014, and though his death was attributed to the vague world of drug trafficking, his loss helped to quell all the momentum against the extraction project. Outside of Sinaloa, the deaths of other activists draws a much clearer connection between crime and the suppression of resistance. In the nearby state of Chihuahua, Ismael Solorio Urrutia and Manuela Solis Contreras had spent their entire lives fighting for their local community and all local communities across the country. When Mag Silver, a Canadian mining company, began exploration operations for their new Cinco de Mayo project, Ismael and Manuela began to put up a fight anew. Unlike in their previous activism though, this fight led to tension immediately. The small town of Benito Juarez became a hotspot for crime, undercover federal agents, and conflicts between local resistance and Mag Silver. Soon enough, Ismael and Manuela were dead, shot in the backs of their heads by an assassin who had stopped them on the side of the road. Though Mag obviously denies any connection to the deaths or the general rise in crime in the city, the Cinco de Mayo project continues on to this day, though it is now in the control of another Canadian mining company, Apollo Silver. My goal in telling these stories is not to lob any massive accusations against any particular company or the projects that they are carrying out in Mexico. Though I obviously have my personal biases, I think that the stories I've outlined here at least provide reasonable grounds to suggest that the relationship between transnational corporations and organized crime should at least be investigated by those trying to do serious journalism in Mexico. With regards to the CNN video, I think that their narrative and journalistic choices contribute to the ridiculous idea that the profound economic development of Sinaloa is somehow unrelated to the even more profound humanitarian crisis. To talk about one, but to fail to talk about the other, is a failure in giving your video a proper scope. And the amount of labor necessary to investigate these issues is not outside of the picture for a full team of internationally renowned journalists. The crew could have talked to Oroco Corp, they could have talked to the private security contractors that these companies hire, or they literally could have talked to any one of the massive handful of American, Canadian, and Chinese extraction companies operating in the region. They could have talked to organizations that fight for the rights of the displaced. REMA, or the Mexican Network of People Affected by Mining, often talks directly about the government's complicity and the way that transnational corporations benefit from the violence. And I'm sure that they'd have people more than willing to give a compelling interview to CNN. More victims of organized crime could have been interviewed, and their thoughts and opinions could have been used to formulate a more precise and pointed thesis. Frankly, it is pretty gross that CNN would take all of their manpower, all of their resources, and all of their worldwide connections just to make a video feeding into narratives that are so painfully dumbed down and even more painfully misleading. It is an insult to CNN audiences to think that viewers are not capable of consuming journalism that is any more serious than the slop that they served in that video. People want to understand what is going on, they want little-known truths to be made public, and they want answers for the pain that they see on the screen and within their own communities. CNN does none of that, opting only to show you more emotional reactions and almost nothing of substance. That is beyond shameful to me. It took me between 2 and 3 weeks to put together the research for this video, and in that time, I uncovered so much information and so many sources that the stuff I talked about today literally only scratches the surface. There is so much more history I could have talked about, so many more people I could have mentioned, and so many more factors that have gone into the past 20 years of chaos that Mexico has seen. I want this video to be the first of many that I make to chip away at the false narratives propped up by governments and global media enterprises about the issues facing Mexico and the global South as a whole. For now, I hope this video serves as a touchstone for what it looks like when a journalistic institution fails at its job. A lot of the comments on the CNN video praise Isabel Young for her bravery in going to these places and talking to people that few have talked to. And while I think that she deserves credit for putting her feet on the ground in these places, I think that those efforts amount to nothing when the revelations she makes chalk up to so little. There are so many journalists right now doing the exact same thing that she did, but with even more journalistic rigor. But they don't get the praise or applause because they don't have fancy job titles at these massive journalistic corporations. And let's not forget that you can only get those fancy job titles if you fall in line enough with the corporate narratives that keep the global hegemony as it is. I hate to break it, but there are no dissidents or truth tellers at CNN. In any sense, I hope you learned a thing or two from this video, and I hope you stick around for when I return to this issue to uncover the things that I didn't have time to talk about today. I think that this video has gone on for long enough, but I'll part with the reminder that as much as the liberal media tries to posit itself as the ideological counterpoint to Trump and the Republican Party, they almost always serve the same interests and fight for the same exact goals. So long as our media environment is managed and massaged by corporate interests, the systematic depoliticization and intentional confusion campaigns will continue across all issues that affect real people. Keep this in mind the next time you read news about literally anything from migrants to the Middle East or even to housing, because nothing is as simple or detached from material and political interests as the media might make it seem. Until next time, thanks for watching.